Well, hello. Yuris Kaja, speaking to you from Riga, Latvia again. Where else? And doing this in English, partly because I got a comment on my last video blog, which was in Latvian, from a Latvian dude who said, don't you understand that most of us understand English? Why are you doing this?" Well, all I can say is that when it comes to people you meet on social media in Latvia, strangeness is a feature and not a bug. What I want to talk about today, yes, I guess addresses that issue of what Latvians are talking about on social media. I got criticized because in what I had said in my uh, Latvian video blog was that I could understand what was going on in places like Portland and Seattle and across the US, the Black Lives Matter protests, and the kind of unfortunate side effects such as rioting and looting. And I pointed out that maybe some of the harsh reaction to the presence of federal officers in a place like Portland was part of a general animosity toward police authority in the United States that was to a large extent triggered and fed by what happened in Washington when President Trump decided to go take a picture of himself in front of that Church of the Presidents or whatever it's called near the White House. And a considerable amount of force was used to disperse thousands of people, most of whom were peacefully protesting, minus maybe a few people who were shouting at the police or tossing objects. In return, these people were scattered using explosive crowd control devices, impact projectiles, and whatever else. So I would say that the hostility toward authority and law enforcement in a lot of places in the US is explainable by this. It's explainable that law enforcement is not seen as a neutral arbiter of everyday conflicts. I mean, somebody you call when your bicycle has been stolen or if you've been assaulted on the street, but that it was been used as a repressive tool, especially this whole federal contingent of border guards and DEA and various other mysterious agencies, even the Federal Dog Catcher Service, which I sort of mentioned, even though one such thing doesn't exist in my Latvian text. And here in Latvia, there is a tendency for at least the people that I interact most with on Twitter to sort of lean very much toward the kind of ultra conservative viewpoint that look, all these nasty people in Portland, all these protesters, all these rioters, they should be repressed in the harshest possible way, and which I think is a kind of dangerous reflection of a kind of undercurrent of authoritarianism and support for harsh police state methods, which is kind of surprising in a country that has actually experienced in the past harsh police state methods. And one of the comparisons I drew, and it was a very, very far-fetched comparison. It was between the feds in Portland and the Soviet special police force called OMON that was here in Riga and that actually had a shootout with, or at least was shooting at civilians on the street in the spring of 1991, in January 1991, killed several people, really shot the town up in order to repress the movement for Latvian independence at the time. Now, okay, Black Lives Matter, Latvian independence, OMON, and the feds are, they don't really fit together perfectly, but you get the idea, or Latvians should get the idea of what it feels like to have a so-called law enforcement contingent arrive that you didn't ask for, and that seems to be bent on snatching people off the street and bent on intimidating and scaring those who, in one way or another, protest against things like the way the police have treated black people and the way the police have treated protesters, most of whom have been peaceful. Uh, Also, one could mention, and I did mention in I think in my Latvian video blog, that the police concentrated in the U.S. mainly on surrounding and watching and monitoring and oftentimes pushing back or scattering largely peaceful processions of demonstrators, of Black Lives Matter, whatever, while at the same time, in the kind of aroused atmosphere in various cities, the looters and hooligans and whoever turned out was smashing store windows and damaging small businesses and looting them, which took place actually with little or no police presence. Now, if the police had the resources, if the police were smartly working to prevent this kind of damage, they would have had folks out in the street keeping people away from breaking windows in small businesses and smashing up private property that in no way has anything to do with the way the police have treated black people or others that are from minority groups. So that's basically what I said, and of course there was a bit of a storm of criticism and the usual stuff. You know, it's neo-Marxists and all of that, and one runs up against this incredibly stubborn and almost sort of aggressively ignorant viewpoint that there's really no difference between Scandinavian social democracy and Stalinism. You know, like, what do you say to people like that? How do you deal with people like that? So you call them, you know, as I have on Twitter in Latvian, I've called them total idiots. You know, so what else are you going to say? I mean, if you don't see the difference between Stalin, North Korea, and Sweden or New Zealand or wherever, that's absolutely crazy. But that's what we have here 30 years after this country, or almost 30 years after this country regained its independence from the Soviet Union. You still have a lot of this kind of bizarre post-Soviet mentality among some people. And it even filters down to the younger generation, because I think some of these people who are coming at me on social media and calling me a cultural Marxist and their various other bizarre names, are people who were children when the Soviet Union was collapsing, or teenagers. You have to be, you know, roughly 50 years old or so to have experienced anything of the Soviet times as a aware, conscious adult. You know, somebody over the age of 18. You know, so but anyway, it's strange, and I guess people should know this rather strange aspect of Latvia. So what else is going on? And we're having sort of single digit up and down or zero digit COVID infections. Restrictions are sort of easing. People will be able to go to certain theater performances starting after the 1st of August, which is good because my son Matis is now today putting on a online theater kind of multimedia performance about classic Latvian Soviet era films and the acting styles that were used then. It's going to be a pretty interesting thing. It's on at 7 p.m. local, or whatever time it is where you are. So if you are Latvian, if you are listening to this, go into Facebook and look up what Deep Sea Studios has posted about this event. But anyway, he plans to put this on the real stage at some point in the fall. So hopefully there will be no new restrictions. There will be there will be the possibility to stage live performances in front of normally large audiences. Uh, so that's that. The other issue here that seems to be bubbling under the surface in Latvia is a domestic issue. I mean, aside from the whole municipal extra elections coming up at the end of the month that I've discussed before, is the fact that there is a major reassessment of real estate values, or the so-called cadastral, whatever the hell that means, values of properties here in Latvia, which could lead to a drastic rise, or so it is argued, a drastic rise in the real estate tax that people have to pay directly or indirectly, either because they own the property or because it gets passed on to them from their landlord. And then there's this whole mystical thing that you don't really own an apartment. If you bought an apartment, you also own a kind of mystical part of the entire property. So there is a tax on the entire property, and the land on which it stands, you also get charged that instead of, whatever it is for the 80 square meters of apartment that you have. But it's a bizarre system, and it's kind of system that gets people all upset, especially where we have an atmosphere here in Latvia that people still don't really trust the government to spend any taxes that it collects wisely. There is a lot of kind of tax resistance and gray economy evasion of paying taxes on the one hand, because of this, the suspicion that taxes will not be wisely spent, which, strangely enough, is counterbalanced by constant carrying on about the fact that doctors and nurses and school teachers and others are not paid enough. Well, where is the money going to come from? It all comes ultimately from taxes, unless you're, a teacher in a private school, or unless you're a doctor in a private practice, which of course there are. But this is where Latvia must still square the circle. That is to say, they must understand that all of the public services that everybody wants and desires and criticizes have to be paid for out of the state tax revenues. At the same time, you cannot continue just griping about or evading or minimizing how much tax you pay, because the two phenomena are connected. If there's not enough money to pay doctors, it's because there's not enough money paid in by the population to the tax system, whether one thinks the tax system works efficiently or not, or whether one thinks that public funds are wasted or not. But that again requires more public political organization and activity, which is a bit lacking here in Latvia. There are no really major broad-based political parties that can, getting back to the idea of social democracy, that like you have the so-called workers movement in Sweden, Arbetarrörelse, as the Swedes call it, which includes the unions, the Social Democratic Party, various other organizations. This was, of course, at its peak in the 1970s and 80s, but nonetheless, there are societies that are far more organized and mobilized than Latvia that could be used as a good example of where to go. So, well, that's that. That's what I have to say, sort of summarizing a bit of what I said the other day in Latvian. And I hope my Latvian viewers who think that I don't respect their knowledge of English will listen to this. Well, that's about it. And I've gotten my haircut, great haircut, by Baiba on Chaka Street at a place called Stila Codes, Style Code, whatever you want to call it. Great place. Call them, drop in. Well, you can't drop in. You have to make an appointment to get a haircut. Do it. This is Juris Kaja signing off from Riga, Latvia.